picture it. You, strutting into the Middle Ages with your cell phone, your oat milk latte, and smug belief you could totally vibe with history. Well, you wouldn't. You'd die. I'm Max Calloway. Let's dive into it. Think your life is hard? You wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what medieval people dealt with daily would shock you to your core. Let's talk about medieval food. The stuff that would have you running back to the 21st century faster than you can say McDonald's. First off, forget everything you've seen in movies about grand feasts with giant turkey legs. For regular folks, meals were bland, boring, and often dangerous. Most people ate a diet that was about as exciting as watching paint dry. Peasants lived mainly on something called pottage, basically a sad, watery soup made from whatever vegetables they could grow, cooked in the same pot for days. It was the medieval version of Mom's mystery stew, except instead of hiding vegetables, it was hiding weevils and dirt. Bread was the main food for almost everyone, but it wasn't the fluffy, sliced stuff we enjoy today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often filled with all sorts of unwanted extras. The flour used was typically ground between stone wheels that would chip off into the mix. People back then had stronger teeth not from good genes, but from constantly chewing on what was basically rock-filled dough. Here's a terrifying fact. Much of the bread contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, burning sensations, and sometimes death. Some historians believe ergot poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria because entire towns would start hallucinating at once. Imagine thinking your neighbor is a witch when really your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Meat was a luxury for most people. When they did get it, it was often borderline rotten because there was no refrigeration. To mask the taste of spoiling meat, they used heavy spices, if you could afford them. Otherwise, you just held your nose and hoped for the best. The 5-second rule in medieval times was more like the 5-day rule. The worst part? You couldn't even wash down this awful food with water because drinking it would make you sick. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste and other nasty stuff. Instead, everyone, including kids, drank beer or ale. Not the strong stuff we have today, but a weaker version that was safer than water because the brewing process killed germs. One study found that the average medieval peasant consumed about 8 pints of ale per day. Children as young as 5 regularly drank ale with every meal. Medieval kids didn't need to fake IDs to drink. They needed them to get water instead. Fish was another common food, but usually preserved by drying or salting, since fresh fish spoiled quickly. People living by the coast might get fresh fish, but for inland dwellers, fish arrived days or weeks old. The smell alone would knock you out. By now your stomach is probably turning, which brings us perfectly to the next medieval horror. For the average person, going to the bathroom meant using a chamber pot, basically just a bowl or bucket kept under the bed. Once filled, you'd either empty it yourself or wait for someone to collect it. Where did they empty it? Usually right out the window and into the street below. The medieval version of "look out below" wasn't about falling objects, but falling feces. The common practice in towns was to simply shout "Gardez-vous" before tossing waste from upper windows. This warning came from the French phrase "garde à l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. Of course, by water, they meant something far less pleasant. This practice was so common that in some medieval cities the rule was that waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 at night. If you were lucky enough to visit a castle, you might encounter something called a garderobe, essentially a hole in a stone seat that dropped waste straight down the castle wall. In Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe that dropped waste nearly 70 feet. Kings and queens might have had thrones, but their toilets were just holes with a draft. For those who couldn't wait to get home to their chamber pot, the options were grim. Public areas often had designated spots where people would relieve themselves, creating what we'd now call open sewers. In London, there were places called common privies built over rivers, but these were few and far between. The job of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to workers with the unfortunate title of gong farmers. These brave souls would collect waste from cesspits and take it outside the city walls. They could only work at night, and the smell clung to them so badly they weren't allowed in public gathering places. Despite the awful conditions, gong farmers were actually paid quite well, about 4 times what an ordinary laborer made. The smell of medieval cities was legendary. The River Thames in London was so polluted with waste that it was described as a monster of stink. Toilet paper? Forget about it. People used whatever was available, leaves, moss, their left hand, or, if they were wealthy, pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had actually used sponges on sticks that they would rinse in vinegar or salt water, but that knowledge was mostly lost by medieval times. After spending a day drinking ale to avoid waterborne illness, just to avoid your ass exploding on the person behind you, I think you'd be begging for your Starbucks or coffee bean if you're a peasant. Forget those romantic notions of being a valiant knight or a fair maiden in a castle. In medieval times, most people worked back-breaking jobs from sunrise to sunset, with barely enough pay to survive. Most people were peasant farmers who worked the land owned by nobles. Their daily routine? Wake up at dawn, work until dusk, collapse into bed, repeat until death. A typical farmer plowed fields using wooden tools pulled by oxen, planted seeds by hand, and harvested crops with basic sickles. During harvest season, peasants worked 16-hour days in the baking sun. Records from medieval England show that a typical farm worker would burn over 4,000 calories daily just from physical labor. Medieval farmers didn't need gym memberships. They just needed to survive Tuesday. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, usually in spring and at the end of summer. Many believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. During winter months, people might go 4 to 5 months without washing. Head lice were so common that special combs for removing them were standard grooming tools. Medieval dating profiles would have included only moderate lice infestation as a major selling point. Clothing was uncomfortable, rarely washed, and worn until it fell apart. Undergarments were made of rough linen that irritated the skin. Outer garments were heavy wool that itches constantly. Both rich and poor typically owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes total. Shoes were made of thin leather with flat soles that provided no protection from the elements. The language barrier would be nearly insurmountable. Middle English from the 1400s sounds almost like a foreign language to modern English speakers. Common phrases like "Hyatt," "Is thin Nama," or "What is your name?" would be incomprehensible. You'd struggle to understand others, and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Privacy didn't exist. Most households consisted of one room where everyone ate, worked, and slept together. Beds were shared by multiple family members, and sometimes travelers would share beds with strangers at inns. Even wealthy homes had servants present at all times, including during private moments. Entertainment options were limited and often violent. Public executions drew large crowds and were treated as festivals. Animal baiting, where dogs would attack chained bears or bulls, was popular. Less violent options included watching traveling performers or listening to bards tell stories, but these were infrequent treats. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. The feudal system meant everyone had a fixed place, and social mobility was nearly impossible. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing and worked land belonging to nobles. Moving up in the station or changing occupations rarely happened. Knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the gaps. Most people believed in witches, demons, and magical creatures. Medical problems were attributed to evil spirits, bad air, or astrological influences. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, believing the world was ending. Medieval fact-checking consisted of asking the oldest person in the village if they'd heard the same thing before.
Hey man, what does it burn when I pee?
News traveled at the speed of a walking messenger or horseback rider. Let's talk about armor. Only the wealthiest knights could afford full-plate armor, which cost roughly the equivalent of a modern sports car. A complete set of plate armor represented about 2 to 3 years' worth of income for a skilled craftsman. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments called gambesons, perhaps with a few metal plates sewn on if they were lucky. Without garbage collection, trash piled up on streets or was tossed into the nearest river. Butchers dumped animal entrails and blood right outside their shops. The smell was so overwhelming that people carried small pouches of herbs called pomanders to hold under their noses. The medieval version of air freshener was slightly less terrible smelling stuff to mask the horrible smelling stuff. Tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, worked with urine and toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and gave them horrible smells that followed them. Pure finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. The pay for most jobs would barely cover basic survival. A day laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy about 2 loaves of bread. Got a fever? Time for bloodletting. This involved cutting open a vein and draining blood into a bowl. Medieval doctors had one solution for everything. You've got too much blood. Let me fix that for you. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. Dental problems were particularly awful. With no proper toothbrushes or understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay was common. Medieval dentists didn't need appointments. They just waited until someone was screaming loud enough to be heard through town. Even if you were innocent, simply being accused of a crime could ruin your life. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Once accused, you were basically presumed guilty, and the burden was on you to somehow prove otherwise through these horrific ordeals or trials. If the legal system didn't kill you, perhaps you'd survive long enough to experience another medieval terror. Real medieval combat was chaotic, brutal, and almost certainly fatal for the average person. Wars happened constantly. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, fighting dragged on from 1337 to 1453. That's 116 years of on and off conflict. The average medieval person would experience multiple wars during their lifetime, unlike today where many people live their entire lives without seeing combat firsthand. So here's the truth. The Middle Ages weren't this romantic fairy tale. They were non-stop fear factor marathon with worse food, more rats, and a kill rate that would make modern pandemics look like a pillow fight. And if you think you toughed it out through this, and you're built different, I got bad news. You're built for Wi-Fi and climate control, man. Out there, you're just another body in the cart. Subliminal Bleed is a product of the Imagination Archive. If you enjoyed this video, we'd like to invite you to subscribe, turn the bell on, and don't miss anything else from your dimension and beyond. My name is Max Calloway, and if you're listening to this, you're one of us.